The sun had barely risen, but Jamal Harris was already on the road. The cold morning wind cut through the air as he pedaled his old bicycle, dodging fallen branches on the trail that wound through the small town. He enjoyed the tranquility of the mornings. The silence, broken only by the sound of tires on the gravel road, gave him a rare moment of peace. At 17, Jamal's life was a constant mix of responsibilities. He delivered newspapers before school, worked as an apprentice mechanic in the afternoons, and at night, did his best to help his mother, Deborah, with the bills and to take care of his younger sister, Chloe. Jamal slowed down as an owl took off from a nearby branch. The narrow road was surrounded by tall trees, and rays of sunlight began to pierce through the leaves, lighting up the path. Despite all the hardships, he took pride in being able to help his family, even if it meant giving up much of his youth. He pedaled faster to deliver the last newspapers and still make it to class on time. A metallic crash echoed through the forest, breaking the silence. Jamal stopped his bike abruptly, his heart racing. He looked ahead, trying to understand what had happened. There was an overturned car, smoke rising from the engine. For a moment, he froze. Should he approach? What if the car exploded? He remembered his mother's words, "If you can help, do it. Don't think twice." Jamal dropped his bike on the grass and ran toward the vehicle. When he reached the car, he saw it was upside down, its wheels still spinning slowly. The metal was crumpled, and shards of glass littered the ground. In the driver's seat, a man in a suit was trapped in his seatbelt. Blood dripped from a deep cut on his forehead, and his head was slumped to the side. "Sir? Hey, can you hear me?" Jamal shouted, knocking on the window, but there was no response. He tried to open the door, but it was jammed. The smell of fuel was strong, and the smoke was starting to intensify. He looked around desperately, his eyes landing on a large rock. Grabbing it, he smashed the window until it shattered, pieces falling into the car. Ignoring the light cuts on his arms, Jamal unlocked the door, forced it open, and unfastened the man's seatbelt. "Come on, man. Don't give up," he muttered to himself as he pulled the man out. He dragged him several meters away from the car, feeling the strain in his arms from the weight of the body. When he finally placed the man in a safe spot, the man began to moan softly. Jamal leaned in, checking his vital signs. He was alive but unconscious. "You're safe now," Jamal said, more to himself than to the man. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching engine caught his attention. A gray sedan slowed down on the road. Jamal waved frantically. "Please! Call an ambulance," he shouted. The sedan's driver, an older man, looked at Jamal and the injured man on the ground but, instead of stopping, sped up and disappeared around the curve. Jamal huffed in frustration. "Seriously? Is this how people act?" He shook his head and turned his attention back to the injured man, trying to recall basic first aid lessons. He needed to keep him stable until help arrived. Inside the gray sedan, Walter Price drove in silence, his mind racing. He was a middle-aged businessman, used to mistrusting everything and everyone. When he saw the young black man near the wrecked car, his instinct was suspicion. What was he doing there? Tampering with the car? Trying to steal? Walter justified his decision not to stop, convinced something was amiss. "Someone else will deal with this," he muttered to himself, heading toward town. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the silence of the road. An ambulance and a police car arrived almost simultaneously. Jamal waved, indicating where the injured man was. Paramedics rushed to assist the driver, while two police officers approached Jamal. They watched him for a moment before one of them asked, "Did you call?" Jamal shook his head. "No. A car passed by and must have called. I just pulled him out of the car. He was trapped." The other officer looked at the wrecked car and then at Jamal. "You pulled him out by yourself?" he asked, seemingly surprised. "Yes," Jamal replied, trying to hide the exhaustion in his voice. He needed help. The first officer took down Jamal's name and other details. "Wait here. We need to talk to you later." Jamal nodded, watching as the paramedics placed the unconscious man on a stretcher. One of the officers approached him again. "Good work, kid. You may have saved his life." Jamal shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." "Don't be so sure," the officer replied with a faint smile. "Not everyone stops to help." As the ambulance departed, Jamal got back on his bike and started pedaling again. But the weight of what had just happened still lingered. He looked at his hands, still trembling slightly. He had saved a life, but why did it feel like something was wrong? On the horizon, Walter Price drove toward town, his face thoughtful. He had called the police, reporting what he had seen. But what exactly had he reported? Maybe it was better to say he had noticed something suspicious. After all, he was just doing his part, wasn't he? The smell of fresh coffee filled the small kitchen of the Harris household, blending with the sound of an old radio playing softly on the counter. Deborah Harris moved quickly, preparing breakfast while glancing anxiously at the clock on the wall. The table was set with mismatched plates, and Chloe, her youngest daughter, sat scribbling in a notebook, distracted. "You're sure you don't have school today?" Deborah asked, raising an eyebrow as she sliced pieces of bread. "No, Mom. It's a holiday," Chloe replied without looking up from her drawing, a picture of Jamal wearing a superhero cape. Deborah smiled, shaking her head. Despite the hardships, moments like these made her feel she was succeeding in keeping the family together. "Well, use the time to help me out later, young lady." "No drawing all day." Chloe grumbled a response, just as Jamal walked through the door, his cap tilted back and headphones hanging around his neck. He looked exhausted but still managed a smile. "You're late today, champ," Deborah commented, frowning. "You know Mr. Coleman's going to complain." "Oh, he complains no matter what," Jamal replied, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "But I did all the deliveries. That's what counts." "You look off," Deborah observed, studying him closely. "Is everything okay?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, the images of the accident still vivid in his mind. "Yeah, Mom. Just a long morning." "Remember, we're counting on you," Deborah said gently. "I know you're carrying a lot on your shoulders, but you're strong." Before Jamal could respond, a loud knock on the door echoed through the house, interrupting the moment. They exchanged surprised looks. Deborah wiped her hands on her apron and headed to the door, her heart inexplicably racing. When she opened it, she saw two uniformed police officers standing at the entrance. The taller one had a stern expression, while the other held a clipboard. "Mrs. Harris?" the taller officer asked. "Yes." "What's going on?" Deborah replied, her voice laced with tension. "We're here to speak with Jamal Harris," the officer continued. "Is he home?" Deborah instinctively positioned herself in front of the door, shielding the officer's view of the house's interior. "Yes, he's here." "But why?" The shorter officer glanced at his clipboard before speaking. "Ma'am, your son is being arrested on suspicion of attempted murder and theft." The weight of those words hit Deborah like a punch. "What? This must be a mistake. My son would never do something like that." Jamal, who had been listening from the kitchen, quickly approached. "What's going on here?" he asked, confusion etched on his face. "Are you Jamal Harris?" the officer asked. "Yes, that's me." "But this doesn't make any sense." "I haven't done anything." "We have a formal complaint and preliminary evidence," the taller officer said as he pulled out handcuffs. "We need to take you in for questioning." "This is ridiculous," Deborah exclaimed, trying to block the officers from approaching Jamal. "He has the right to an attorney, doesn't he? You can't just take him like this." "He'll have his rights," the officer replied firmly. "But we need to follow procedure." Chloe began to cry, clinging to Jamal's arm. "Don't take my brother. He didn't do anything." Jamal tried to stay calm, though his nerves were on edge. "It's going to be okay, Chloe," he said, kneeling to look her in the eyes. "I'll prove I didn't do anything." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists as Deborah continued to protest. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered among themselves, exchanging suspicious glances. "I always thought that boy was up to something," an older woman murmured, looking at Deborah with disdain. "This is an injustice," Deborah shouted, but the officers ignored her as they guided Jamal to the patrol car. Jamal held his head high as he got into the police car, but inside, he felt the weight of every stare and every comment. It was as if all his efforts to prove he was more than his life's circumstances had been erased in an instant. At the police station, Jamal was placed in a cold interrogation room with white walls and a single metal table in the center. He couldn't stop thinking about his mother and Chloe, wondering how they were coping with this. Two detectives entered the room, bringing a folder of documents. The older one sat across from Jamal, while the other stood by the door. "Jamal Harris," began the seated detective. "Do you know why you're here?" "No," Jamal replied, trying to stay calm. "I saved that man. The car was on fire, and I pulled him out. That's all." "We have a witness who saw you at the accident scene," said the standing detective. "They claim you were tampering with the car, looking suspicious." "Suspicious?" Jamal repeated, incredulous. "I was trying to save his life." "Who do you think called the ambulance?" "No one's sure who called," the seated detective replied, opening the folder. "But what we do know is that there are inconsistencies in your story." Panic rose in Jamal's throat. "I didn't do anything wrong," he exclaimed. "I was just helping." "You can tell that to your lawyer," the standing detective said, crossing his arms. "For now, you'll remain in custody." Jamal fell silent, feeling the weight of the moment. He had always known the world could be cruel, but he never imagined he would become a victim of it. In the waiting area, Deborah sat with trembling hands. Every second felt like an eternity. After hours of waiting, she was finally allowed to see Jamal. "Why are they doing this, son?" she asked, trying to hold back tears. Jamal looked at her, his eyes full of sadness. "Because someone decided I look guilty, Mom. Just for being there." "We'll fight this," Deborah said, gripping his hand tightly. "I promise, we'll get you out of here." As Deborah embraced him, Jamal closed his eyes and tried to gather strength. He knew his innocence was real, but he also knew that, for many people, it didn't matter. Henry Turner woke up to intense pain in his head. The bright hospital room lights were almost unbearable, and the monotonous beeping of the machines by his side brought him back to reality. He tried to move, but a sharp sting in his ribs made him stop. "Mr. Turner, stay still," said a nurse as she adjusted the pillow under his head. "You were in an accident, but you're out of danger now." Henry blinked, trying to recall what had happened. Fragments of memory began to surface, the sound of the crash, the world turning upside down, and then, someone. A figure pulling him out of the car. A voice saying, "You're safe now." Who got me out of there?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "A young man passing by," the nurse replied. "The paramedics said he risked his life to save you." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, letting the blurry images settle in his mind. "A young man? He saved my life?" A wave of gratitude washed over him. "I need to find him," he said, his voice firmer. "I want to thank him personally." "Rest, Mr. Turner," the nurse replied with a gentle smile. "Tomorrow, you'll have more information." The next morning, Marla, his personal assistant, entered the room with a tablet in hand and a worried expression. "Henry, how are you feeling?" she asked, pulling up a chair to sit by his bedside. "I've been better," Henry replied with a tired smile. "But I'll survive." "Did you find out who the young man was who helped me?" Marla hesitated, fidgeting nervously with the tablet. "Yes, sir. His name is Jamal Harris." "But, there's more you need to know." "More?" Henry frowned. "What happened?" "He's been arrested," Marla said, tension thick in her voice. "Yesterday afternoon, the police charged him with attempted murder and theft. There's a complaint against him." Henry was silent for a moment, trying to process. "That's ridiculous," he finally said, sitting up despite the pain. "That boy saved my life. He has nothing to do with this." "I know," Marla replied. But apparently, a witness claims they saw Jamal acting suspiciously at the scene. "I want to speak to the police," Henry said, his voice resolute. "Now." At the police station, Henry was met with surprise. His reputation preceded him, and the chief quickly escorted him to the office. "Mr. Turner," the chief said, offering him a seat. "I hope you're recovering well." "Thank you," Henry replied. "But I'm here because I learned the young man who saved my life has been arrested. I want to know why." The chief assumed a professional yet reserved expression. "We received a complaint from a witness at the scene. The account claims the young man was acting suspiciously before the police arrived. Also, you were unconscious, so you can't be certain of what happened." Henry gripped the armrest of the chair tightly. "I'm telling you, he saved my life. How is that not enough to refute such an absurd accusation?" "Mr. Turner," the chief replied, crossing his arms. "Your statement carries weight, but we have to follow protocol. The complaint came from a reliable witness, and the case is now in the hands of the prosecutor." "This is outrageous," Henry murmured, shaking his head. He turned to Charles Hampton, his attorney, who had accompanied him. "We need to do something." Charles adjusted his glasses and replied calmly, "Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon. The system often presumes guilt based on biases. We need concrete evidence to overturn this accusation." Henry looked back at the chief. "I want it on record that this boy is innocent. He risked his life to save me. And I'll do whatever it takes to ensure he isn't unjustly incriminated." After leaving the station, Henry was visibly shaken. In the car, he turned to Charles. "What do we do now?" "We gather evidence," Charles replied. "We need to prove Jamal's innocence by dismantling the witness account and showing he had no motive to commit the crime he's accused of." "Then do whatever it takes," Henry said. "And get me a meeting with him. I want him to know he's not alone." At the station, Henry met Jamal in a visitation room. The young man was handcuffed but kept his head high as Henry entered. There was surprise and distrust in his eyes. "Mr. Turner," Jamal began. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I couldn't just stand by knowing what's happening," Henry replied, sitting across from him. "This is absurd. You saved my life." Jamal shrugged, his shoulders tense. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not everyone would do what you did, Jamal," Henry said sincerely. "And now, it's my turn to help you." Henry Turner was not a man who gave up easily. Accustomed to facing challenges in the business world, he was determined to use every resource at his disposal to prove Jamal's innocence. Sitting in the office of his attorney, Charles Hampton, Henry examined a stack of documents scattered across the table while Charles organized his notes. "We need to dismantle the witness's account," Henry said firmly. "Walter Price, right? The man who made the complaint." "Exactly," Charles responded, adjusting his glasses. "Walter Price is the sole witness supporting this baseless accusation. He claims he saw Jamal tampering with the car and acting suspiciously before the police arrived." Henry frowned. "And who is this Walter Price? Why didn't he stop to help but was quick to call the police?" "Good question," Charles replied. "I discovered he owns a small business in the neighboring town. No known criminal record, but he's filed similar complaints in the past, all involving young black men." Henry shook his head, outraged. "This has to stop. I want us to investigate every detail about this man. He needs to be held accountable." As Henry and Charles worked on the case, an unexpected development arose. Luis Alvarez, a truck driver who regularly made deliveries along that route, walked into the police station after seeing local news reports. He asked to speak with the chief, holding a pen drive in his hand. "I was on that road that morning," Luis explained. "I passed the accident shortly after it happened. I saw a boy dragging a man away from the car. He looked like he was helping, not stealing." The chief looked at Luis, intrigued. "And why didn't you stop to help?" Luis lowered his head, embarrassed. I was running late for a delivery and thought someone had already called for help. But when I saw that they arrested the boy, I realized I should have said something earlier. Luis handed the pen drive to the chief. My dashcam might have captured something useful. I thought you should see it. Charles was informed about the existence of the video and immediately pressured the station to release the footage. When he and Henry finally obtained access, they watched the content in silence. The truck's dashcam showed the moment Luis passed by the scene. Although the footage was shaky, it clearly captured Jamal dragging Henry away from the overturned car. There was no doubt, Jamal was trying to save a life. This changes everything, Henry said, pointing at the screen. This proves he wasn't stealing. He's a hero. It's a start, Charles replied seriously. But we still need to challenge Walter Price's statement. He claimed he saw Jamal alone, but that doesn't align with the video. Plus, I want to delve into his history. Something about this man doesn't sit right. A deeper analysis of Walter's background revealed a troubling pattern. He had made several similar complaints in the past against young black men in his community, always alleging suspicious behavior. None of these complaints led to real investigations, but the pattern was undeniable. In court, during a new preliminary hearing, Charles presented these findings. The case against Jamal Harris hinges on Walter Price's testimony, Charles began, addressing the judge. But the evidence shows that this testimony is, at the very least, inconsistent. He presented the truck driver's video, which was shown in the courtroom. Everyone watched as Jamal dragged Henry away from the car, his face showing clear effort and urgency. This video unequivocally shows that Jamal was saving a life, not committing a crime. Furthermore, Charles continued, Walter Price's account contains glaring flaws. He claimed to have seen Jamal alone at the scene, but this doesn't explain how he knew someone was in the car. His narrative is, at best, questionable. Charles also highlighted Walter's history of complaints. This man has a pattern of behavior that must be scrutinized. He uses the justice system as a tool of prejudice, and Jamal Harris is his latest victim. The judge listened attentively, calling for a recess to review the evidence. While they waited, Henry placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We're almost there," Henry said. "You're going to get through this." Jamal nodded, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. For the first time since it all began, he felt like he had a real chance. When the session resumed, the judge made a brief but decisive announcement. The charges against Jamal Harris are dismissed. The evidence presented demonstrates that not only is he innocent, but he acted heroically in saving Henry Turner's life. Walter Price will be investigated for filing a potentially false report. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Deborah, seated in the audience beside Chloe, cried tears of relief. Henry smiled with satisfaction, while Charles gave a slight nod of approval. Jamal walked out of the courtroom a free man, but the weight of what had happened still lingered on his shoulders. As he stepped outside, surrounded by his family and Henry, he realized his fight wasn't over. He didn't just want to clear his name, he wanted to ensure no one else would have to endure what he had. The golden light of the sunset bathed the small Harris home, highlighting its worn walls and modest yard. Jamal sat on the porch, watching Chloe play with crayons on a piece of cardboard. She was scribbling figures with exaggerated smiles, her attempt to depict the family. Although he was physically free, the feeling of being judged still hung over Jamal. He knew clearing his name on the streets would be harder than in court. "Jamal, come help with the table." Deborah's voice called from inside the house. "Coming, Mom." Jamal replied, ruffling Chloe's hair before getting up. The house, though modest, felt warm and inviting. Every corner told a story of struggle and resilience, from the old furniture to the family photos hanging on the walls. Jamal grabbed the plates and began setting the table, but a knock on the door caught his attention. "Who could that be now?" Deborah muttered, wiping her hands on her apron as she went to answer the door. Opening it, she found Henry Turner and Charles Hampton standing there. Henry held a bottle of wine, while Charles carried a leather briefcase. "Good evening, Mrs. Harris," Henry said with a kind smile. "I hope we're not intruding, but I'd like to speak with Jamal." "May we come in?" Deborah hesitated for a moment, still cautious, but finally stepped aside to let them enter. "Of course. Jamal's in the kitchen." Henry walked in, glancing around. He noticed the details of the home, the simple furniture, the stack of schoolbooks on the shelf, and the old family photos on the walls. It was a home built on love and hard work, and he felt a deep respect for the family. "Mr. Turner," Jamal said, quickly standing up. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I should have come sooner," Henry replied, shaking Jamal's hand. "But I wanted to wait until things had settled down. Now that you're home, I thought it was the right time." Charles greeted Jamal as well but quickly turned his attention to Deborah. "Mrs. Harris, we understand what your family has been through in recent weeks. We're here to help ensure that no one else suffers the same way." Deborah crossed her arms, watching the two men with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "We want to file a lawsuit against Walter Price," Charles said directly. "Not just to hold him accountable, but to send a clear message that false accusations have consequences." Deborah let out a heavy sigh, moving closer to the table. "Won't that bring more trouble for us? Don't get me wrong, I want justice for my son, but we've already been through so much." "I understand your concern, Mrs. Harris," Henry said gently. "But this isn't just about Jamal. It's about preventing something like this from happening again. And I won't let you face it alone." Jamal, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. "Suing Walter, will it change anything? He's already tarnished my reputation. Some people still look at me like I'm guilty." "Maybe we can't change everyone's minds," Henry said, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "But this isn't just about what happened to you. It's about fighting for something bigger. And I promise to stand by you every step of the way." Deborah still looked hesitant, but Chloe broke the silence. She pulled her drawing notebook onto the table and showed them a new illustration. It was simple but powerful. Jamal was standing, holding scales of justice in one hand, with her and Deborah by his side. "You're going to win, Jamal," Chloe said with the innocent confidence of a child. "Because you're the strongest brother in the world." Jamal chuckled, pulling Chloe into a tight hug. "Thanks, Chloe. You're my inspiration." Henry watched the scene with a smile, visibly moved. He realized this family was more than resilient. They were proof that strength comes from love and unity. "Charles," Henry said, turning to the lawyer. "Let's do this. Not just for Jamal, but for the Harris family and everyone else who faces injustices like this." Charles nodded, opening his briefcase to discuss the next steps. As they talked strategy, Jamal felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just reacting to circumstances anymore. For the first time, he was taking control of his own story. The conference room at Charles Hampton's office was bathed in morning sunlight. The table at the center of the space was covered with papers, folders, and notes. Henry Turner, Jamal Harris, and Deborah sat side by side, while Charles organized the latest documents related to the case. Chloe, ever curious, was quietly drawing in a corner of the room, though she kept one ear tuned to the conversation. "All right," Charles began, adjusting his glasses. "The case against Walter Price has strong potential, but we need to tread carefully. Our focus will be on 3 key points: the false testimony, Walter's pattern of behavior, and the hard evidence, such as the truck driver's video." Jamal stared at the papers on the table, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. "Do you think this will make a difference?" "He doesn't seem like the kind of person who's going to admit he was wrong." "Maybe not immediately," Charles replied. "But with the right pressure and irrefutable evidence, we can force a resolution. And this isn't just about him. It's about exposing the system that allows people like Walter to act without consequences." Deborah nodded, though her expression remained worried. "I just want this to be over soon. I can't take seeing my son treated like he's guilty any longer." Henry leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on Deborah's shoulder. "I promise, Mrs. Harris, we'll resolve this. And more importantly, we'll do it the right way." Charles continued explaining the legal details, but Jamal's mind began to wander. He thought about how everything had started: the accident, the rescue, the arrest. It was hard to believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. He felt the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about proving he was more than the assumptions people made about him. Later that day, Jamal returned to the auto shop where he worked as an apprentice. The smell of oil and heated metal was familiar and comforting, but something felt different. As he worked on adjusting a car engine, he noticed the glances from some customers and coworkers. They whispered among themselves, their eyes often drifting back to him. "You doing okay, kid?" asked Mr. Coleman, the shop owner. A burly man with a stern expression but a kind heart, Coleman always looked out for Jamal. "Yeah, I'm fine," Jamal replied, trying to sound casual. "Just trying to focus on work." "Don't pay attention to what people say," Coleman said, crossing his arms. "I know who you are. And I know you didn't do anything wrong." "Thanks, sir," Jamal replied, feeling a small weight lift. "That means a lot. Remember this, kid," Coleman said, patting him on the shoulder. "The people who matter are the ones who know the truth." Despite Mr. Coleman's support, Jamal still felt the growing pressure of proving his innocence, not just in court but to his community. He wondered if he would ever be treated the same again or if the cloud of suspicion would follow him forever. Meanwhile, Henry and Charles were busy investigating Walter Price's past. They uncovered that Walter had made similar accusations in the past, all targeting young black men and alleging suspicious behavior. None of these complaints had led to actual investigations, but the pattern was undeniable. "It's obvious he's using the system to fuel his biases," Henry said, flipping through the reports. "But how do we present this in a way that not only the court sees it but also acts on it?" "With data," Charles replied. "We need to document every case, every pattern. This not only strengthens our claim against him but also sets a precedent to prevent this from happening in the future." Henry nodded. "What about the community? I think it's important to make this public." "I agree," Charles said. "But we have to be careful not to turn this into a media circus. We want to raise awareness, not inflame." As the days passed, the case against Walter gained momentum. Charles compiled all the evidence: the truck driver's video, the inconsistencies in Walter's account, and his history of biased complaints. Meanwhile, Henry began leveraging his influence to bring attention to the case, reaching out to journalists who could cover the story responsibly. The night before the hearing, Henry visited the Harris family's home. He brought pizza for dinner and sat with the family in the cozy living room. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Henry asked, looking at Jamal and Deborah. "We are," Deborah replied, holding her son's hand. "But it's still scary." "I understand," Henry said reassuringly. "But remember, you're not alone. We're all in this together." Chloe, who was drawing on the floor, lifted her notebook and showed them a new sketch. It depicted a courtroom scene, with Jamal standing tall, surrounded by his family, while a pair of scales of justice hovered above him. "You're going to win, Jamal," she said with a smile. "Because you're my hero." Jamal smiled, feeling a renewed sense of strength. He knew the fight was far from over, but with his family by his side and allies like Henry and Charles, he was ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as people settled into their seats. Reporters lined the sides, ready to capture every moment of the case that had garnered national attention. Jamal sat between Deborah and Henry, while Charles Hampton adjusted his papers at the front. Despite trying to appear confident, Jamal couldn't stop his heart from racing. He glanced at the audience and saw familiar faces from the neighborhood, some with expressions of support, others filled with skepticism. Across the room, Walter Price sat next to his lawyer, who was whispering to him in a low voice. Walter appeared less confident than before, nervously adjusting his tie. "All right, everyone," Charles said, turning to Jamal and Deborah. "Remember, the most important thing is to stay calm. We have the evidence, and it speaks for itself. Jamal nodded, but his unease was evident. Deborah squeezed his hand, as if to transfer her strength. "We're with you," she said. The trial began with Charles delivering his opening statement. He was direct, laying out Walter's pattern of behavior and how his actions were driven by prejudice rather than facts. "Walter Price filed a false complaint," Charles said firmly. "And this complaint not only endangered Jamal Harris's life but also perpetuated the stereotypes that continue to plague our society." On the other side, Walter's lawyer tried to shift the focus. He argued that Walter acted as a concerned citizen who had no way of knowing what was truly happening at the scene of the accident. But then Charles began presenting the evidence. The truck driver's dashcam video was shown to the court. The footage clearly depicted Jamal dragging Henry Turner away from the car, struggling with the weight and urgency of the moment. There was nothing in the video that suggested suspicious behavior. On the contrary, it showed a young man heroically saving a life. The courtroom fell silent when the video ended. Walter avoided eye contact, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "And now," Charles said, holding up another document, "we'll examine Mr. Price's pattern of behavior. He has a history of filing similar complaints against young black men, all of which were unfounded. This demonstrates a repeated and troubling bias." Walter's lawyer attempted to argue that this history was irrelevant, but the judge allowed it to be presented. The tension in the room grew as details of Walter's past actions were revealed. Finally, Walter was called to the witness stand. He looked hesitant as he approached, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the situation. "Mr. Price," Charles began, "do you acknowledge that you did not see Jamal Harris commit any criminal act on the day in question?" Walter avoided looking directly at Jamal. I thought he was tampering with the car," he muttered. "You thought," Charles repeated, his voice firm. "Based on what?" "He was saving a man's life, as the evidence has shown. You didn't stop to check or offer assistance. You simply assumed." "Why?" Walter hesitated. He glanced at his lawyer, who gestured for him to remain silent. But something shifted in his expression. He looked defeated. "Because I was prejudiced," Walter finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw a young man near the car and I made assumptions." The courtroom was utterly silent. Charles pressed on. "And those assumptions were based on what, Mr. Price?" Walter took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "On biases I've never confronted. I was wrong." The murmurs returned, and the judge had to bang the gavel to restore order. Walter continued, ignoring his lawyer's furious expression. "I realize now I had no right to do what I did. Jamal Harris is a hero, and I treated him like a criminal. I'm sorry." From her seat, Deborah gripped Jamal's hand, overwhelmed with emotion. Henry smiled faintly, appreciating Walter's acknowledgement, while Jamal stared at the man who had caused so much pain to him and his family. By the end of the day, the judge delivered the decision. The charges against Jamal had already been dismissed, but Walter was now formally charged with filing a false report and ordered to pay significant damages. Additionally, the judge recommended that Walter participate in educational programs about prejudice and racism. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Walter approached Jamal. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I know my words don't mean much now, but I'm sorry, Jamal. I promise to do better." Jamal was silent for a moment before responding. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now. But I'm glad you're willing to change. That means something." Walter nodded, seeming more relieved than he expected, and walked away. Outside the courthouse, Jamal was surrounded by his family and Henry. Chloe ran up to him, clutching her sketchbook. "I knew you'd win, Jamal. I knew it." "This wasn't just my victory," Jamal said, looking at Henry and Charles. "It was all of ours." Henry placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "And now, it's time to make sure this victory means something for others." Jamal smiled, feeling for the first time in weeks that the weight on his shoulders was beginning to lift. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but now, he wasn't walking it alone. Mr. Coleman's auto shop was busier than ever. The sound of tools echoed through the space as Jamal worked on the engine of an old car. His hands were covered in grease, but the smile on his face showed that he was finally starting to feel like his life was back on track. "You're doing good, kid," Mr. Coleman said, crossing his arms as he watched Jamal work. "The way things are going, I might have to start calling you boss soon." Jamal chuckled, closing the car hood. "I've still got a lot to learn, sir." "Yeah, but you've already learned the most important lesson," Coleman said, his expression serious. "Don't let anyone tell you who you are. You show them who you are." That night, back home, Deborah was preparing dinner with Chloe. The house felt more alive than it had in weeks. Hanging on the wall was a new photo, Jamal and Henry Turner standing side by side, taken on the day of their courtroom victory. Chloe glanced at the picture as she scribbled yet another drawing in her notebook. "Do you think people will remember what my brother did?" Chloe asked. "They will," Deborah said firmly. "And if they don't, we'll remind them." Meanwhile, Henry Turner sat in his office, reviewing plans for a new community program he was funding in partnership with Walter Price. Despite carrying the weight of his past mistakes, Walter had kept his promise to change. The program, designed to educate youth and combat prejudice, was only the first step. "This doesn't erase the past," Henry said, gazing out the window. "But it's a good start." The following morning, Jamal found himself walking along the trail where the accident had happened months before. He stopped at the same spot, looking out at the horizon. The weight of the past was still there, but now, it felt lighter, easier to bear. Chloe ran up to him, grabbing his hand. "What are you thinking about?" "That some things don't need to be forgotten for us to move forward," he said, squeezing her hand. "And that we never stop fighting." With a smile, the two of them continued walking. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.